You're crouched in a muddy ditch in Holland, October 1944. Rain soaks through your uniform. Your hands are shaking, not from cold, but from adrenaline. 30 yards ahead, a German machine gun is chewing up the street. Two of your friends are bleeding out in the open. No one's coming to help. The radio's dead. Your platoon leader is looking at you, waiting for an answer you don't have. This is the moment Staff Sergeant Floyd Talbert lived over and over again, in Normandy, in Nuenen, in Bastogne. The moment when everything depends on one man's decision. The moment that follows you home, even when the war ends. Years later, Dick Winters, a man who didn't hand out compliments, would say, "If I could choose only one man to go on a combat mission with me, it would be Talbert." But after the war, a best-selling book would describe him as a drinker and drifter, a label his family would fight to remove. Who was the real Floyd Talbert? And what really happened on that street in Nuenen? If you want the full story, not the Hollywood version of the men who fought in World War II, subscribe to Heroes Under Fire. We dig deeper. Floyd M. Talbert was born on August 26, 1923 in Kokomo, Indiana, a town of factories, farms, and families still recovering from the Great Depression. His father worked hard to keep 5 kids fed and clothed, and Floyd learned early that nobody owed you anything. You worked for what you got. You kept your head down, did the job, and didn't complain. Kokomo wasn't glamorous. It was the kind of place where most young men graduated high school, got a job at the plant, maybe married their high school sweetheart, and spent the rest of their lives within 20 miles of where they were born. That was the deal. That was normal. But Floyd wasn't just another kid punching a clock. He was an athlete. On the basketball court, he was known for his long set shots, the kind that required focus, patience, and calm under pressure. You don't make those shots by forcing them. You wait for the opening. You take your time. You trust your hands. That quality, staying calm when everyone else is losing their minds, would matter a lot more than basketball later on. After high school, Floyd took a job at Union Carbide's Stellite Haynes plant in Kokomo. It was decent work for a young man in 1942. Steady paycheck, union wages, a future you could count on. He could have stayed there his whole life. A lot of guys did. But on August 24, 1942, 2 days before his 19th birthday, Floyd Talbert walked into Fort Benjamin Harrison in Indianapolis and enlisted in the United States Army. That decision alone didn't make him special. Millions of young men were doing the same thing after Pearl Harbor. The country was at war, and it needed bodies. What made Floyd different was what he did next. He volunteered for the Paratroopers. Let's be clear about what that meant in 1942. The Paratroopers weren't just another branch of the Army. They were an elite force, volunteers only, with physical standards that washed out most men who tried. The training was brutal. The pay was higher, $50 extra a month, called jump pay, but you earned every penny. And the casualty rates? They were the highest in the Army. Paratroopers were the first ones in. They jumped behind enemy lines, often at night, with no guarantee of landing where they were supposed to, or landing at all. Once you hit the ground, you were cut off, surrounded, and expected to complete your mission anyway. No armor, no artillery support, just you, your rifle, and the men who jumped with you. Most soldiers didn't volunteer for that. Floyd did. He was assigned to Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. If those numbers don't mean much to you, here's what matters. Easy Company would become one of the most famous units in American military history. But in 1942, it was just a group of young men about to find out what they were made of. And the place where they'd find out was Camp Toccoa, Georgia, a place where the easy part of Easy Company ended real fast. Camp Toccoa, Georgia, in the summer of 1942 wasn't a training camp, it was a crucible. The men who arrived there were volunteers, sure, but volunteering and surviving were two different things. Easy Company was commanded by Captain Herbert Sobel, a man whose idea of leadership was to break you down until only the unbreakable remained. Every morning started the same way, a run up Mount Currahee, 3 miles up, 3 miles down. Currahee was a Cherokee word meaning stands alone, and by the time you reached the top, you understood why. Your lungs burned, your legs screamed, and if you fell out of formation, Sobel made sure you remembered it. But the mountain was just the beginning. There were forced marches with full packs in the Georgia heat. There were obstacle courses designed to simulate combat. There was close order drill until your boots wore through. And there was Sobel, always watching, always finding something wrong, always pushing. Some men quit, some men washed out, but Floyd Talbert stayed. He wasn't the loudest guy in the company. He wasn't the biggest, but he had something that couldn't be taught. Steady hands, a calm head, and the ability to lead without barking orders. When things got hard, and they always got hard, Talbot didn't fold. He kept moving. He kept the guys around him moving. That's what being a non-commissioned officer, an NCO, was really about. Not yelling, not acting tough, just being the guy who doesn't quit when everyone else wants to. The paratroopers called it esprit de corps, a French phrase meaning spirit of the body. It's the pride you feel in being part of something bigger than yourself, the belief that your unit is different, better, tougher than anyone else, and Easy Company had it in spades. They needed it, because in December 1942, Easy Company was about to face one of the most famous tests in U.S. Army history, the march from Toccoa to Atlanta. Roughly 115 miles, full packs, full gear, no vehicles, no brakes unless the officers said so. It was a test of endurance, discipline, and whether this group of men could function as a unit under stress. Floyd Talbot made that march. So did men like Walter Smokey Gordon, Carwood Lipton, and Bill Guinier. They marched through rain. They marched through cold. They marched until their feet bled and their shoulders went numb from the weight of the pack. But they finished. And when they did, something had changed. They weren't just volunteers anymore. They were paratroopers. They were Easy Company. One officer noticed Talbot more than most. His name was Richard Dick Winters, a young lieutenant who would eventually become Easy Company's most respected commander. Winters didn't hand out compliments. He was quiet, disciplined, and careful about who he trusted. But years later, after the war, after all the battles and all the blood, Winters would say something about Floyd Talbot that he said about almost no one else. If I had to choose just one man to be with me on a combat mission, it would be Talbot. Think about that. One man, out of an entire company of elite soldiers, men who jumped out of airplanes into enemy fire, men who held the line at Bastogne, men who captured Hitler's Eagle's Nest. Winters would choose Talbot. Why? Because when everything went wrong, when the plan fell apart and the bullets started flying and your friends were dying in the street, Talbot was the guy who didn't freeze. He didn't panic. He made the call. And more often than not, he made the right one. That kind of trust isn't given lightly. It's earned over and over again. By the spring of 1943, Easy Company had completed jump school at Fort Benning. They'd made their 5 qualifying jumps. They'd earned their silver wings and their jump boots. They were paratroopers now, officially. But being a paratrooper meant more than wearing the uniform. It meant living by a code. You volunteered for this. You knew the risk. You accepted it. And when the time came, you'd be expected to march farther, fight harder, and hold the line longer than anyone else. For men like Floyd Talbot, that wasn't propaganda. That was the deal. In the summer of 1943, Easy Company shipped out to England. They trained for the invasion of Europe. They ran drills. They studied maps. They waited. And on the night of June 5th, 1944, they loaded into C-47 transport planes, strapped on their parachutes, and flew into the darkness over the English Channel. Destination, Normandy, France. Mission, jump behind enemy lines, secure key roads and bridges, and hold them until the invasion force arrived from the beaches. For Floyd Talbot, this was it. Everything that Toccoa and Sobel and Currahee had been preparing him for. The question was simple. Would he be ready? The answer was about to come at 13,000 feet, in the dark over occupied France. June 6, 1944, D-Day. The largest amphibious invasion in human history was about to hit the beaches of Normandy. 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, over 150,000 Allied troops storming 5 beaches along the French coast. But before the first landing craft hit the sand, before the first soldier waded through the surf under German machine gun fire, 13,000 paratroopers jumped into the darkness behind enemy lines. Floyd Talbert was one of them. A combat jump isn't like the training jumps at Fort Benning. There's no instructor yelling at you to tuck and roll. There's no soft Georgia field waiting below. You're jumping at night, loaded down with 100 pounds of gear, into a country held by an enemy that's been waiting for you. The plane is shaking from anti-aircraft fire. The sky is lit up with tracers, and you have no idea if you're going to land where you're supposed to or if you're going to land at all. The 101st Airborne Division's mission was clear. Secure the roads and causeways behind Utah Beach, destroy bridges to prevent German reinforcements from reaching the coast, and hold key positions until the invasion force broke through. Simple on paper, hell in practice. Because the jump was a disaster. High winds, heavy cloud cover, and anti-aircraft fire scattered the paratroopers across miles of French countryside. Units were broken up. Officers couldn't find their men. Men couldn't find their units. Some paratroopers landed in flooded marshes and drowned, weighed down by their gear. Others landed in the middle of German positions and were killed before they hit the ground. Floyd Talbert landed somewhere in the dark, cut away his parachute, and did what every paratrooper was trained to do: find someone, anyone, from your unit and complete the mission. That's the reality of airborne operations. You don't get to wait for orders. You don't get to regroup and make a plan. You hit the ground running and you figure it out as you go. Easy Company's objective was to secure exits from Utah Beach and link up with forces pushing inland. It took hours, sometimes days, for scattered paratroopers to find each other and form effective fighting units. But they did it, because that's what paratroopers do. Talbert's first taste of combat wasn't a dramatic charge or a heroic last stand. It was confusion, exhaustion, and the constant awareness that the guy next to you this morning might be dead by noon. By June 8th, Easy Company was fighting in Carentan, a key crossroads town that the Germans were defending hard. The battle was brutal. House-to-house fighting, snipers, machine guns dug into hedgerows that turned every field into a maze of death. The hedgerows of Normandy were unlike anything the Americans had trained for. They were thick, ancient earthen walls topped with dense bushes and trees, dividing the countryside into tiny compartments. Each hedgerow was a natural fortress. You couldn't see through them, you couldn't shoot through them, and when you tried to advance across an open field to the next one, German machine gunners cut you down. This was combat at its most basic and most brutal. Move, shoot, communicate, survive, and then do it again tomorrow. Floyd Talbert learned fast. He learned that heroics got you killed. He learned that the best leaders were the ones who stayed calm, made quick decisions, and kept their men alive. He learned that war wasn't about glory. It was about doing the job and getting home. But he also learned something darker, that some of your friends wouldn't make it home, that you could be talking to a guy one minute, and the next minute he's on the ground, bleeding out, and there's nothing you can do. That's the part they don't show in the movies, the guilt. The weight of watching men die and knowing you survived. Easy Company fought through Normandy for weeks. Carentan, the hedgerows, small villages with names most Americans had never heard of. They took casualties, they lost friends, but they held the line. And through it all, Floyd Talbert did his job. He led his squad, he made the tough calls, he earned the trust of the men around him and the respect of officers like Dick Winters. By the time Easy Company pulled back for rest and refitting in July 1944, Talbert wasn't a rookie anymore. He was a combat veteran. He knew what it felt like to be shot at. He knew what it smelled like when a body had been lying in the sun for 2 days. He knew the sound a man makes when he's dying and calling for his mother. He also knew that Normandy was just the beginning, because in September 1944, the Allies were planning something even bigger, a massive airborne operation to punch through the Netherlands, cross the Rhine River, and drive straight into the heart of Nazi Germany. The operation was called Market Garden, and it was going to send Floyd Talbert and Easy Company into a small Dutch town called Nuenen, where the plan would fall apart, the enemy would be waiting, and Talbert would earn a nickname that would follow him for the rest of his life: the Knife Man of Nuenen. By September 1944, the Allies were winning. Paris had been liberated. The Germans were retreating across France. The war looked like it might be over by Christmas. British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery had a plan to make that happen. It was bold, it was ambitious, and it required the largest airborne operation in history. The plan was called Operation Market Garden. Here's how it was supposed to work. 35,000 paratroopers and glider troops, American, British, and Polish, would drop into the Netherlands and capture a series of bridges over major rivers and canals. That was Market. Meanwhile, a column of British armored divisions would race up a single highway, Highway 69, which the soldiers called Hell's Highway, crossing each bridge as it was captured, driving north through Holland and into Germany. That was Garden. If it worked, the Allies would bypass Germany's heavily fortified Siegfried Line, cross the Rhine River, and be in position to strike at the industrial Ruhr region, the heart of Nazi war production. The war could be over in weeks. If it didn't work, thousands of paratroopers would be stranded behind enemy lines, cut off and slaughtered. The 101st Airborne Division, including Easy Company, was assigned the southern sector. Their job was to capture and hold bridges around the city of Eindhoven, keeping the road open for the British tanks. It was supposed to be the easy part of the operation. It wasn't. On September 17, 1944, Floyd Talbot made his second combat jump, this time into Holland. Unlike Normandy, this jump happened in daylight. The men could see the ground, they could see each other, and the Germans could see them. Anti-aircraft fire tore through the sky. Planes were hit. Paratroopers were killed before they even left the aircraft. But Easy Company landed, regrouped, and started moving toward their objectives. The Dutch countryside was different from Normandy. Flat, open fields crisscrossed by canals and dikes, small villages with narrow streets, brick houses, and very little room to maneuver. It was terrain that favored defenders, especially defenders with machine guns and anti-tank weapons, and the Germans had both. The biggest intelligence failure of Market Garden was this: Allied command believed the German forces in Holland were weak, disorganized, and retreating. They were wrong. In fact, 2 SS Panzer divisions, the 9th and 10th, were refitting near Arnhem, just north of the operational area. These weren't broken, demoralized conscripts. These were elite, experienced troops with tanks, self-propelled guns, and a very clear understanding of how to defend urban terrain. And one of the places they decided to defend was a small town east of Eindhoven called Nuenen. Easy Company, along with British tanks from the Guards Armored Division, was ordered to move toward Nuenen as part of a reconnaissance in force, essentially a probe to see what the Germans had in the area. On paper, it made sense. In reality, it was a recipe for disaster. Here's why urban combat is so deadly. Streets become kill zones. Armored vehicles lose their advantage because they can't maneuver. Infantry has to move slowly, checking every window, every corner, every doorway. And if the enemy has heavy weapons positioned in buildings or at intersections, they can pin you down and destroy you before you even see them. The veterans, men like Talbert, knew this. They'd fought in Carentan, they'd fought in the hedgerows. They knew what it felt like when a mission didn't smell right. And Nuenen didn't smell right. There was no solid intelligence about German strength in the town. Radio communication was spotty. The British tanks were moving too fast, outpacing the infantry. And the narrow streets meant that if something went wrong, there was nowhere to go. Something went wrong. On October 22, 1944, Easy Company and a column of British tanks entered Nuenen. The streets were quiet, too quiet. The civilians had already cleared out, always a bad sign. Then the shooting started. German fire erupted from buildings, from hedges, from positions the Allies hadn't spotted. Machine guns, Panzerfausts, German anti-tank rockets, possibly a self-propelled gun or a tank hidden in a side street. The British tanks, moving in a tight column, were perfect targets. One was hit almost immediately. It brewed up, tanker slang for catching fire, and blocked the street. The other tanks couldn't advance. They couldn't turn around. They were trapped. And so was Easy Company. Paratroopers scattered, diving for cover behind walls, into ditches, anywhere that wasn't the middle of the street. Officers were shouting orders. NCOs like Talbert were trying to keep their squads together, trying to return fire, trying to figure out where the hell the enemy was. This is the moment Floyd Talbert lived for, and the moment that would haunt him later. Because when the plan falls apart and men are dying and no one knows what to do, someone has to make a decision. And that someone was often Talbert.
In combat, the first 30 seconds after contact determine everything. When the Germans opened fire in Nuenen, those 30 seconds were chaos. The lead British tank was burning. Machine gun fire was raking the street. Paratroopers were scrambling for cover, trying to figure out where the shots were coming from. The problem with urban combat is simple. The enemy can be anywhere. Behind that window, in that doorway, around that corner. And until you see the muzzle flash, you're shooting at ghosts. Floyd Talbert wasn't thinking about strategy or tactics in that moment. He was thinking about keeping his men alive. As an NCO, a non-commissioned officer, Talbert's job wasn't to make grand operational decisions. That was for the officers. His job was simpler and harder. Keep your squad together, keep them moving, and make sure they don't freeze up when the bullets start flying, because freezing gets you killed. The German defenders had picked their positions well. They had fields of fire covering the main street. They had anti-tank weapons positioned to take out the British armor. And they had infantry support to deal with the paratroopers. For the Allies, the only way out was to flank them. Military term for moving around the side of an enemy position to attack from an angle they're not covering. You can't go through a machine gun. You can't outshoot it, but you can go around it. That means leaving cover. That means moving through streets you haven't cleared. That means trusting the guys next to you to cover you while you move. And it means someone has to go first. Talbert was the kind of NCO who went first. We don't have a minute-by-minute account of what Floyd Talbert did in Nuenen. We don't have a citation for a specific act of heroism. What we have are the memories of the men who were there, the reputation he earned, and a nickname that stuck, the Knife Man of Nuenen. That nickname is part history and part myth, and it's important to be honest about the difference. Here's what we know for certain. Easy Company was in Nuenen. They were ambushed, they took casualties, and they withdrew under fire after realizing the German resistance was stronger than expected. Here's what we know about Talbert. He was an experienced, aggressive, and reliable NCO who had already earned Dick Winter's trust in Normandy. He was the kind of soldier who stayed calm under fire and made quick decisions when others hesitated. Here's what we don't know: the exact actions that earned him the Knife Man nickname. Some accounts suggest it's tied to close quarters fighting in Nuenen. Others link it to a later incident called the Night of the Bayonet, which we'll get to in a moment. And some suggest the nickname is a conflation of multiple actions filtered through memory, retelling, and eventually the HBO series Band of Brothers. That's the challenge with military history, especially at the individual soldier level. Memory is unreliable, stories get polished, and sometimes the legend becomes stronger than the facts. But here's what doesn't need a legend. Talbert and Easy Company fought their way out of Nuenen, regrouped, and lived to fight another day. The mission was incomplete, the reconnaissance failed, but the men survived. And survival in a situation like that is a victory in itself. The aftermath of Nuenen was sobering. Easy Company had lost men, the British had lost tanks, and Operation Market Garden, which was supposed to end the war by Christmas, was starting to look like a mistake. The problem wasn't the paratroopers, they'd done their job. The problem was the plan. The intelligence had been wrong, the enemy was stronger than expected, and the single narrow highway that the entire operation depended on was a killing ground. By the end of September, Market Garden was effectively over.
The British Airborne forces at Arnhem, the famous Bridge Too Far, had been decimated. Thousands of Allied paratroopers were dead, wounded, or captured. The Rhine crossing never happened, and the war wouldn't end by Christmas. But Easy Company wasn't done, not even close. In December 1944, they would be rushed to a place called Bastogne, where they'd faced the worst winter in decades, surrounded by German forces and told to hold the line no matter what. And somewhere in the freezing darkness of that Belgian winter, Floyd Talbert would be part of an incident so brutal, so primal, that someone would write a poem about it. An incident that would earn a name whispered among the men of Easy Company, the Night of the Bayonet. Stories like this, the ones that don't fit the Hollywood script, are what Heroes Under Fire is all about. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next one.
December 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. If you've heard of one battle from World War II's Western Front besides D-Day, it's probably Bastogne. The 101st Airborne Division, including Easy Company, was rushed there to stop a massive German counteroffensive known as the Battle of the Bulge. The situation was desperate. The Germans had broken through American lines with 3 armies, hundreds of tanks, and a plan to split the Allied forces in 2 and recapture the port of Antwerp. Bastogne sat at a critical road junction. Whoever controlled it controlled the battle. The 101st arrived just in time, and then they were surrounded. For weeks, Easy Company fought in the coldest winter Europe had seen in decades. Temperatures dropped below zero, snow was waist-deep, foxholes filled with ice, men got frostbite so bad they lost fingers and toes. Ammunition ran low, food ran out, and the Germans kept coming. This wasn't a firefight, this was a siege, and somewhere in the frozen darkness outside Bastogne, Floyd Talbert and a group of Easy Company men fought an engagement so vicious, so close, and so brutal that it became known as the Night of the Bayonet. A bayonet is a knife or blade attached to the end of a rifle, designed for one purpose: stabbing someone when you're too close to shoot. It's the oldest, most primitive form of warfare, and in modern combat it's rare because most firefights happen at a distance, but not always. The details of that night are murky. We don't have an official after-action report that spells out exactly what happened. What we have are the memories of the men who were there, passed down through reunions and interviews, and eventually dramatized in the HBO series Band of Brothers. What we know is this: Easy Company men, including Talbert, were involved in a nighttime engagement where the fighting got so close that bayonets were used. Hand to hand, face to face, the kind of combat that leaves psychological scars no Purple Heart can recognize. Someone later wrote a poem about that night. The details have been lost to time, but the fact that a poem was written at all tells you something. This wasn't just another firefight. This was something that haunted the men who lived through it. Because killing someone with a rifle from 100 yards away is one thing. Killing someone close enough to see their eyes, to smell their breath, to feel them fighting back, that's something else entirely.
And Floyd Talbert lived through it. This is the part of war that doesn't make it into the recruitment posters, the part that follows you home, the part that wakes you up at 3 a.m. 30 years later. But here's the thing about soldiers. They learn to cope, and one way they cope is with dark humor. May 1945, Berchtesgaden, Germany. The war in Europe was over. Hitler was dead. The Third Reich had collapsed, and Easy Company, along with other Allied units, had captured the Eagle's Nest, Hitler's mountain retreat in the Bavarian Alps. Among the spoils of war was Adolf Hitler's personal staff car, a heavily armored Mercedes-Benz with bulletproof glass and reinforced plating. Most soldiers would have taken a photo and moved on. Floyd Talbert decided to test whether the bulletproof glass actually worked. He climbed into the back seat, posed for a photo, and then grabbed a rifle loaded with armor-piercing rounds and shot at the windows to see if they'd hold. They did. Then, for good measure, Talbert drained the water from the radiator before the car was turned over to the officers. Why? Because he could. Because after everything he'd been through, Normandy, Nuenen, Bastogne, the night of the Bayonet, shooting up Hitler's car felt like the least he could do. It was irreverence in the face of tyranny, a small act of defiance against a regime that had built its entire identity on fear, intimidation, and the myth of invincibility. And it was exactly the kind of thing that made Floyd Talbert who he was. Part warrior, part troublemaker, and 100% the kind of man Dick Winters wanted beside him when things got ugly. Because here's what Winters understood. War isn't about following the rules, it's about winning. And the soldiers who win are the ones who stay aggressive, stay sharp, and stay human, even when humanity seems impossible. Talbert had that balance. He could fight like hell when he needed to, he could laugh when the fight was over, and he could keep his men alive when the odds said they shouldn't be. That's why Winters said what he said. If I had to choose just one man to be with me on a combat mission, it would be Talbert. Not because Talbert was fearless. No one who survives combat is fearless. But because when the shooting started and the plan fell apart and men were dying, Talbert didn't freeze. He acted. And in war, action, fast, decisive, and smart, is what keeps you alive.
But survival in war doesn't mean you survive the peace. When Floyd Talbert came home in 1945, he carried Normandy with him. He carried Nuenen, he carried Bastogne and the night of the Bayonet, and the faces of men who didn't make it home. And for decades, he didn't talk about it. He disappeared. Not literally, he had a life, a job, a place to live, but he vanished from the easy company reunions, from the veteran events, from the public memory of the war. For 40 years, Floyd Talbert tried to live a normal life. And then, in 1992, a historian named Stephen Ambrose published a book called Band of Brothers, and suddenly, Floyd Talbert was famous. But the version of him in that book wasn't the whole story. It wasn't even close. 1945. Floyd Talbert came home. The war was over, the parades were done, the speeches were made. America was moving on, building suburbs, starting families, chasing the American dream. But Floyd Talbert was still carrying Normandy. He was carrying the street in Nuenen where the machine guns opened up and the tanks burned and men died before they could find cover. He was carrying the frozen foxholes of Bastogne, where you couldn't tell if your feet were still attached because you couldn't feel them anymore. He was carrying the night of the Bayonet, the kind of thing you don't talk about, even with the men who were there. That's the thing about combat trauma that nobody understood in 1945. There was no term for PTSD yet, no counseling, no support groups. You came home, you got a job, and you were expected to be fine. Most men weren't fine. They just learned to hide it. Floyd Talbert made a choice that a lot of veterans made. He walked away. Not from life, not from responsibility, but from the easy company reunions, from the veteran events, from the constant reliving of the worst moments of his life. For decades, he stayed away. He moved to Redding, California, a small city in the northern part of the state, surrounded by mountains, forests, and rivers. He worked, he lived quietly, and when he had time, he did what brought him peace. He went to the mountains. He hunted. He fished. He spent time around Lake Shasta in the kind of wild, open country that feels 1,000 miles away from burning tanks and frozen trenches. For Floyd Talbert, the mountains weren't an escape. They were a return to something real, something clean, something that didn't require him to be Staff Sergeant Talbert, the Knife Man of Nuenen, the guy Dick Winters would choose for any mission.
Out there, he could just be Floyd. He wasn't running from his past, he was trying to build a future. But he struggled. A lot of veterans did. He drank, sometimes too much. That's not a secret, and it's not something his family tried to hide. Alcohol was how a lot of World War II veterans self-medicated. It was how they coped with memories that wouldn't go away and a country that didn't want to hear about them. But here's what matters. Floyd Talbert got it under control. Late in life, he managed his drinking. He had his finances in order. He had a life that made sense to him, even if it didn't look like the life everyone expected a war hero to live. And then, in 1981, nearly 40 years after the war, Floyd Talbert went to an Easy Company reunion. We don't know what made him decide to go. Maybe he was ready. Maybe he wanted to see the guys one more time. Maybe he just needed to know that the bond he'd felt in combat was still there. He reconnected with men he hadn't seen in decades, men who remembered him, men who knew what they'd been through together. And then, on October 10, 1982, Floyd M. Talbert died in Shasta, California of heart complications. He was 59 years old. For most people, that would be the end of the story. A quiet death, the veteran's funeral, a gravestone in a small-town cemetery. But 10 years later, Stephen Ambrose published Band of Brothers. And then HBO turned it into one of the most acclaimed war miniseries in history. Suddenly, Floyd Talbert was famous. Millions of people knew his name. They knew about Easy Company. They knew about Normandy, Bastogne, and the Night of the Bayonet. But the version of Floyd Talbert they knew wasn't complete. In the book, Ambrose described Talbert as a drinker and drifter, a man who couldn't adjust to civilian life, who wandered from job to job, who never found his footing after the war. And Talbert's family was devastated.
Because that wasn't the whole truth. And for people who loved Floyd Talbert, who knew the man and not just the soldier, that label felt like a betrayal. His brother, Bob Talbert, wrote to set the record straight. Yes, Floyd struggled with alcohol. Yes, he had hard years, but he was not a drifter. He was not a man without purpose or direction. He worked. He lived independently. He had his life together when he died. And reducing him to that one label, drinker and drifter, erased everything else he was. Bob Talbert asked, explicitly, that the description be removed or corrected, because Floyd deserved better than to be remembered as a cautionary tale. He deserved to be remembered as a man who fought with incredible courage, who earned the trust of men like Dick Winters, who survived some of the worst combat of World War II, and who then spent the rest of his life trying to find peace. That's not failure, that's human. And it's a reminder that the men who fought in World War II weren't characters in a movie, they were people. Complex, flawed, struggling, brave, broken, and whole, all at the same time. Floyd Talbert didn't need to be perfect to be a hero. He just needed to be remembered honestly. If you believe veterans like Floyd Talbert deserve to be remembered for who they really were, not just the Hollywood version, then Heroes Under Fire is your channel. Subscribe, and let's keep their real stories alive.
If you had to sum up Floyd Talbert in one sentence, Dick Winters already did it. If I could choose only one man to go on a combat mission with me, it would be Talbert. That's not poetry. That's not sentiment. That's a combat assessment from one of the most respected officers in American military history. Winters led Easy Company through some of the worst fighting of World War II. He saw hundreds of soldiers under fire. He knew who froze, who ran, and who stayed. And when it came down to choosing just one man, he chose Floyd Talbert. Because Talbert had something you can't train. He had the ability to make decisions when everything was falling apart, to lead when there was no plan, to keep his men alive when the odds said they shouldn't be. That's his combat legacy. But his story doesn't end there. Nuenen wasn't just another firefight. It was a symbol. It was a symbol of what happens when intelligence fails, when the enemy is underestimated, when elite troops walk into a trap because someone higher up the chain made bad assumptions. Operation Market Garden was supposed to end the war by Christmas. Instead, it cost thousands of Allied lives and taught a brutal lesson. Even the best soldiers can't overcome bad strategy. But Nuenen was also a symbol of something else: leadership under fire. When the shooting started and the British tanks were burning and men were dying in the street, someone had to keep the unit together. Someone had to make the call to withdraw before more men were killed. Someone had to lead. Floyd Talbert was one of those someones. The nickname Knife Man of Nuenen stuck because it captured something essential about him. He was aggressive, decisive, and willing to close with the enemy when most men would hesitate. Whether that nickname came from Nuenen itself or from the later Knight of the Bayonet in Bastogne doesn't really matter. What matters is what it represented: a soldier who didn't back down. But here's the thing about close combat, the kind where you see the enemy's face, where it's personal, where it's brutal. It leaves scars. Not the kind you can see, the kind that wake you up 30 years later. The Knight of the Bayonet at Bastogne was one of those moments.
We don't know every detail. We don't have an official report that lays it out minute by minute. What we have are the memories of men who were there, and the fact that someone wrote a poem about it afterward. You don't write poems about ordinary firefights. You write them about the ones that haunt you. Bayonet combat is as old as warfare itself and as brutal as it gets. It's not tactical, it's not strategic, it's survival. And Floyd Talbert survived it. Then, a few months later, he was posing in Hitler's staff car, shooting armor-piercing rounds at the bulletproof glass just to see if it would hold, and draining the radiator before turning the car over to the officers. That's the duality of soldiers like Talbert. They live through hell, and then they laugh at it. Because if you don't laugh, you break. But some men break anyway. When Floyd Talbert came home in 1945, he carried all of it with him. Normandy, Nuenen, Bastogne, the Knight of the Bayonet, the faces of men who didn't make it home. And for 40 years, he tried to build a life that made sense. He moved to Redding, California. He worked. He hunted and fished in the mountains around Lake Shasta. He found peace in the wilderness, in places where the only sounds were wind and water and birds, not machine guns and artillery. He struggled with alcohol. A lot of veterans did. There was no PTSD diagnosis in 1945, no counseling, no VA therapy programs. You came home and you were supposed to be fine. Floyd Talbert wasn't always fine, but he didn't give up. And late in life, he got his drinking under control. He had his finances in order. He had a life. It wasn't the life people expected a war hero to have, but it was his. And then, 10 years after he died, a book and a TV series made him famous. Millions of people learned his name, but the version they learned, the drinker and drifter, wasn't the whole story. His family fought to correct that, because Floyd Talbert deserved better than to be remembered as a cautionary tale. He deserved to be remembered as a man who served with incredible courage, who earned the respect of men like Dick Winters, who survived some of the worst combat of World War II and then spent the rest of his life trying to find peace.
That's not failure. That's human. So what's the legacy of Floyd Talbert? It's this. War doesn't end when the shooting stops. The men who fight carry it with them for the rest of their lives. Some carry it quietly, some carry it loudly. Some find peace in the mountains, some never find peace at all. Floyd Talbert found his peace in Northern California, in the wilderness, away from the reunions and the ceremonies and the constant reliving of the worst moments of his life. That doesn't make him weak. It makes him honest. And his story, the real story, not the simplified version, reminds us that veterans are not characters in a movie. They're people. Complex, flawed, brave, broken, and whole, all at the same time. They deserve to be remembered accurately, not as perfect heroes, not as tragic failures, but as men who did an impossible job under impossible conditions and then came home and tried to live. Floyd Talbert did that, and he did it on his own terms. So the next time you hear the name Knife Man of Nuenen, remember this. He was more than a nickname. He was more than a soldier. He was a man from Kokomo, Indiana, who volunteered for the toughest job in the Army, earned the trust of the best officers in the war, survived hell multiple times over, and then spent the rest of his life trying to find the peace he'd fought for.
That's a legacy worth remembering. And it's a legacy that raises a question we should all be asking. How many other veterans are still being remembered through incomplete stories? How many families are still waiting for someone to listen? Floyd Talbert's family spoke up. They corrected the record. They made sure the world knew the whole man, not just the hard years. We owe that to every veteran. Not worship, not pity, just honesty, because that's what they earned. The end.